I'm recording my homily for the third Sunday of Easter, 2018. The gospel for this Sunday is very similar to the gospel last Sunday. So last Sunday, the gospel was from the Gospel of John, and he was recounting the story of Jesus appearing to the disciples at the resurrection, so the day of the resurrection. And then the story continues to the eighth day, so 7 days later, the second Sunday, where Thomas is there, and Thomas has that opportunity to believe in Jesus. And you remember, so the theme that I took with that was how Jesus says 3 times in the Gospel of John to the disciples, he says, "Peace be with you." And he's saying, "Peace be with you," because not just as like a greeting, like, "Hey, how are you guys doing?" But because, we do that during Mass, the Lord be with you. But there's something much more profound there, that Jesus really and truly wanted to give his disciples peace. And I talked about last week what that peace actually meant. So something very profound, something very deep. And I made the connection with peace to mercy. So in order to have true peace, there must be true love. But love gets broken all the time. We live in a broken world. And so the resurrection story was an example of that, where the last time the disciples had seen Jesus was when they were fleeing, they were abandoning him. And so after the resurrection, when he goes to the disciples, that was a very act of mercy, was that he was saying by going back to them that I forgive you, and that you are still my disciples, and I'm still going to trust you with the church, and I'm still going to trust you with everything. So it was a beautiful act of mercy. And then we see that conveyed also through Thomas, who was very defiant at first. Like ourselves, how sometimes we can be. Okay, this week, the gospel is from the Gospel of... I forget. I think it's the Gospel of Luke. Anyways, the story is very similar. Jesus appearing to the disciples on the day of the resurrection. It's just recounted through the eyes of Luke, as opposed to John. But he also says, once again, peace be with you, to his disciples. So I want to talk about the peace, though, but I want to talk about it, how Luke brings it up. He brings it up in the context of fear. And so he's going into a little bit deeper, moment with how the disciples were feeling when they first saw Jesus come back. And it wasn't just this enormously joyful reunion. They were afraid. They thought they were seeing a ghost. And so Jesus says, "Peace be with you." He says, "Fear not, for it is I." And so he's helping them to overcome their fear, and then from that, as we'd see in John, to overcome their insecurities about having left him. But I want to talk about the fear. So peace, if you think about it, when we're afraid, we often don't have peace. When we're really afraid, we simply do not have peace. And so the moment when somebody hears just really bad news, they get a really bad diagnosis from the doctor, generally don't have peace, right? They can be very afraid. Somebody loses their job, how are they going to pay the bills? They can't find a good job, are they going to lose their home? These are moments when there's a lot of fear. When somebody commits a really bad sin that's going to really harm their relationship, there can be a lot of fear behind that. And typically we don't have peace in those moments. So Jesus, when he says, "Peace be with you," he wants to bring peace back when we have moments of fear. Now, the gospel today is very interesting because there's a story. We actually had it in the gospel on Saturday morning for Saturday morning Mass this last week. Very different circumstances, but very similar theme. So the disciples are in the boat, right? And they're in the Sea of Galilee, and they're going from one side to the other, and Jesus is not with them, and they get caught in a storm. There's squall comes up, right? Now, living here in the Seattle area, if you've ever been out in the Hood Canal, if you've ever been out in the Straits when a squall comes up, and they come up really fast. I mean, within minutes it goes from being calm and nice to being blustery and windy, and it can be really dangerous in a small boat. This is why we have the Coast Guard on patrol all the time out in Puget Sound, because things like that kick up. Those things happen. So the disciples get caught out in a storm. So already the first thing that they're afraid of is the storm. But then they see Jesus walking on the water. And again, their first reaction is not one of calmness and peace, but it's of more fear, because they think he's a ghost. They think it's something, it's perhaps something not good. You know, you could think of all the different things that could come to mind when you're caught in a storm, you think you might die, and then you start seeing this apparition. It's like, okay, is this good or bad? Well, they thought it was bad. They thought they became terrified. So Jesus comes over to the boat. He doesn't get in the boat, but he comes over to the boat and he says, don't worry, it is I. And so he starts trying to give them peace in the midst of the storm. Now, the reason I bring this story up is because I love the way it continues. The disciples become so fixated on Jesus that it's almost like the storm goes into the background. The storm doesn't even exist because they're so focused on Jesus. Have you had moments like that where you're in the midst of something really traumatic, but then you become so focused on one thing that everything else just kind of goes away? It's like it almost doesn't even exist. Well, that happens for them. And so the beautiful symbolism of that, they become so focused on Jesus that they don't even realize that their boat gets ashore. And so the symbol is Jesus. When we fixate on Jesus, when we focus our attention on Jesus, he gets us to the shore. It wasn't by our own efforts. It wasn't by our anxiety or stress or worry. But we get peace from being close to him, and then we get ashore, right? I thought it was a beautiful story of that. So again, by focusing on Jesus, we become courageous. We become more courageous. We become at peace in that courage. Now, really the focus of my homily today is, where does that courage come from? Where does the courage come from that gives us peace, right? So you remember the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit? When I edit the video, I'll try to remember to put them up there, so if you want to write them down. The 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. So I have my little way I remember them. Now this is in differentiation of normally the 9 fruits of the Holy Spirit. Okay, so they're different. But the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. So you remember wick, puff. Wick like a candle wick, right? And you puff to blow it out. So wick, puff. The only change you have to make is in the wick, W-I-C-K, you just take out the I. So W-C-K-P-U-F-F. W-C-K-P-U-F-F, okay? Wisdom, counsel, knowledge, piety, understanding, fortitude, fear of the Lord. That was just the first letters of each of those words. So that's my little trick to remember them. Well, today I'm going to focus on 2 of the gifts of the Holy Spirit and how they bring peace. So the first is knowledge, but spiritual knowledge, not book knowledge. A person can read about courage all they want, but doesn't necessarily mean that they grow in it, right? Or they've attained it. So spiritual knowledge is coming to a deeper place, so that knowledge can actually reside within one's heart. And so knowledge of courage and how we get knowledge of courage. So a little example, before I get to the example, so the other gift is fortitude. Fortitude is just another way of saying courage. In the word fortitude, you hear the word fort, right? Something that's strong, something that can endure. And so it's just like courage. Courage helps us to become strong and endure. In the Spanish, fortaleza, right? So you have the same word there. All right, strength, to become strong. So my mom grew up here in Seattle, and when she was growing up, her father loved building boats. He loved being out in boats, and so my mom and her family were often out in their boats, out in the Puget Sound. They would take the boats up to the San Juan Islands. They would go across the straits there. And so when they would do that, they would be in a rather small boat, but they would be out in the waters, and they would be sometimes caught in storms, especially out in the Straits. The Straits can get extremely windy. My mom would say how, she was just a little girl, but they would get caught out in these incredible storms. And when she would watch her father, when she would watch her dad, she never really felt scared. She said all she had to do was just kind of watch her dad. And he was a good boatsman. He was very experienced that way. But she always had courage by watching her father. And so because her father wasn't afraid, because he was in control as much as he can be in control, and because he knew what he was doing, she felt safe. And so knowledge of courage, it comes from the example of others. It comes from watching others who are not afraid in a given situation, others who have courage. I guess you could say it's kind of contagious. And so Jesus, who's walking on the water, is not afraid. And so when the disciples are in the boat and they see him, they become close to him and they watch him, then they lose their fear and they become courageous. When Jesus comes to them in the upper room and he appears to them and he says, "Peace be with you," he's giving them courage because he's not afraid. Many times when I talk to youth these days, if they're communicating to me fears or things are not going right, or there's insecurities there, at some point, if those insecurities are pretty severe, I'll ask them at some point, tell me about your relationship with your parents. Because the reality is, most of our security comes from our parents. Even teenagers, they like to believe that they're independent. They like to believe that they're courageous and they don't need mom and dad and, they're beyond all that. But the reality is that's not true. They really do need people to help them become courageous. The reality is when we were teenagers, we were very insecure. All of us are insecure in some way as a teenagers. That's why teenagers are always trying to fit in, or they're always trying to prove themselves, or they're, and so mom and dad are really important. And a lot of times when I'm asking these questions, when I get to the point of dad, when I say, what's your relationship with your dad? Usually it's not great. Usually it's, well, dad's just kind of distant. Dad doesn't really pay attention to us. Dad's just kind of busy. You say, Dad's a good guy, but he doesn't go to church and he never prays with us and things like that. There's a distance that has formed. There's a chasm that formed in that emotional relationship, and because of that, one of the fruits of that chasm is insecurity, is fear. And so I say this, one, if you're a dad or a mom, is being able to watch for that and say, your example really helps younger people overcome their fears. And it's not just age, right? It's not just about age, but to see in Jesus, to see him with his disciples and how his courage, he's like being dad, right? He's being dad to these disciples, and they're kind of like his sons, and they overcome their fears because of his courage that he's giving them knowledge of by his example. Okay? In our culture today, we're really struggling, especially us as men. And I talked about this a while in my homily. I don't know if I'll go into it a whole lot of detail here, but young men seem to be very afraid. They're afraid of commitment. When I talk to guys who are discerning about entering becoming a priest, there's an incredible fear of commitment. There's an incredible fear of the obligations that arise from that, of not being able to be married, living life of celibacy. But then men also, just of getting married, they'll move in with their girlfriend, they'll shack up, but they won't get married. And so there's this fear of commitment. Now that fear of commitment comes from, I believe, a lack of knowledge of courage. And so they can't give of themselves. They tend to be mired in a certain level of narcissism. They're trapped by their own desires, sometimes sinful desires. And so they're not free. They're not free to give themselves. So I use as an example, kind of like the disciples who have to learn that courage. Now, our young men in our communities, they have to learn it from somewhere. And so hopefully they can see that in us. Hopefully we can communicate that and be a good example of courage, so that they're not being dysfunctional in their life, but they're attaining the vocation that God's given to them, whether it's priesthood, religious life, or to marriage, so that they can become good dads and good fathers, and then pass that on. So it does seem like courage, the knowledge of courage and other virtues, seems like it's passed on in that way, and so hopefully we can do that. My last example, my sister has 5 kids, and her and her husband have 5 kids, and I love watching her husband, their dad, play with the kids and interact with them, because he's very attentive to them. He's very in tune with them, and he likes to play with them, but also he's a good dad. He doesn't just become one of the kids. He's dad, and so there's very clear very clear rules and parameters, and one second. Very clear rules and parameters, and so he interacts with them, and it's beautiful to see that. But then also, when his dad, so their grandpa, when he comes over, he's exactly the same way. And so to see where he learned it from, you can see the connection between him and his dad, and then how he's now passing that on to his kids. And the thing with his kids is that when you watch him interact, that they are so confident in their relationship with him. They're so at ease with him, and because of that, you can see that it gives them courage. They feel confident. They feel confident in that love. So I use that as an example of just one way you see courage being communicated. All right. Peace, in the context of fear, is looking for courage. It's looking for strength. And that is communicated through love, through the people in our life. All right, God bless you. And next Sunday is traditionally called Good Shepherd Sunday, so we'll be focusing on that. Okay, take care.